Okay, now I know that this has been a lot of information and it can get your head spinning because there's like, with the Greeks, okay, let me see if I can just sort of get this broken down for you. Okay, what is it that we really are interested in about the Greeks? Okay, Alexander, we talked about him, his empire, the conquests that he made of that territory is important for us to understand. That conquest of all that territory. Let's go back to that first slide that we have. Okay. Conquest of this territory. They're put on the map for us as Judah. That's where Jesus will, minister in that territory. Okay. So really the primary thing to remember is what's the point here? What is the point of the Greeks? Alexander's conquest. Alexander's conquest of all of that territory is important. Okay, what happens? What's the result of this? Okay, we have the philosophers. It's not so important to know their names, but these people, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and others to come. Hippocrates, you know him. If you have a doctor says the Hippocratic Oath, which is really interesting. Let me read this. This is really kind of interesting. Here is the Hippocratic Oath that a doctor says, "The regimen I adopt shall be for the benefit of my patients, according to my ability and judgment, not for their hurt or for any wrong. I will give no deadly drug, though someone asks for it. I will never aid a woman in abortion. Whatever house I enter, I will do for the benefit of the sick and refrain from any wrongdoing or corruption, and will not participate in any act of seduction with any male or female." That's the Hippocratic Oath that doctors, that's the medical profession that they have to recite. So the Greeks, the Alexander conquest cleared this territory all across there, made it ready. Okay, so let me just go over this so that you understand a little bit better. So the conquest is the important thing. Philosophy, okay, primarily humanistic. So philosophy is really the move towards humanism, that man is the answer for everything. Man makes his way. So the conquest and his idea of spreading the culture, philosophy, the idea of democracy, representative government, people ruling cities and everything like that, philosophy, art, in terms of plays and sculpting and everything like that. And then also this thing, Koine Greek, which is not a classical Greek, which is what, like if you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, which is the epic poems by Homer, if you read those, they would be written in classic Greek. In our Bible, Luke, some of the people say Luke wrote in like a classic Greek style. But this Koine Greek is the language of the people. And if you go back to this, okay, from this entire territory, you think of all the people groups that are involved in that territory. Okay, the Tower of Babel, is down here, where, let's say, let me get the pointer here. The Tower of Babel was probably here. And so you have all these people groups in this area, all this various different people groups speaking different languages. But with the conquest of Alexander the Great, one language becomes the language of the merchants. And with all the travel that's going on, that's what the Romans will bring in. The Romans will bring in the roads. They will bring in the sense of military protection and peace and order. And that is why this is important for us to understand, this conquest of Alexander the Great, and then these things, philosophy, democracy, art, and the Koine Greek language. And written in this language, the Septuagint, the Old Septuagint, Septuagint, if I'm spelling that right. I think there's an A in there, maybe. Septuagint. 70 scholars, that's what sept means, 70. This is the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. Old Testament in Greek. Okay, so Alexander is the kind of person that may have, and this is only this, that may have, once he got a copy of the Greek Old Testament, maybe he carried it with him. I don't know. But people began to read the Old Testament in the Koine Greek language. So that's why we want to understand that's the first foundation of the coming of Christ and then the birth of the church, is this thing that God allowed to happen, this takeover, this man that God allowed to be raised up, Alexander the Great, and all the philosophy and the democratic ideas and the idea, and even the stories of the flawed gods, the story of these gods that were flawed, Zeus and all these things. Even these stories prepared people for something bigger, something better, somebody who was real, somebody who was really from heaven, not someone who just pretended to be from heaven. Okay? I'm sorry. Pardon me. Okay. So now we move on to the Roman era. Okay? The Romans. Okay? Now the Romans, their primary, their contribution, what they didn't really, this territory will become their territory, and then some more of it. But let's get to a place where we can look at what the Roman Empire will look like. Okay. Oops. Okay. This is the coverage of the Roman Empire. Now you see, in the time of Christ, let's just say this is in the time of Christ, up into Britain, Spain, what's known as Gaul, France and part of Germany, what is Netherlands, those things, Italy. Italy is where they first started this territory here. They started taking this territory. The Alps are here, and then there's also a mountain range that cuts through Italy. Mount Etna is on Sicily, this island. These two islands, also Corsica and Sardinia. These are all part of the original Roman Empire. They were well-schooled, well-disciplined people. What was the primary, around 1000 BC, 900 BC, 500 BC, these groups of people started moving down into Italy along the coast, and they settled right along the coast. Rome is right there. You see it right there. That's the city. It's right there in the midst of seven hills, really. It's well defended from the rear, and it's right on the coast there like that, very close to the coast. And so they started, they began to take over what was the Greek Empire. And, the Greek Empire had fractured into 4 parts, and, different groups were fighting for control of what was left, and the Romans were very efficient. They had traditional ideas about family, family, the father, the family structure were very, and the thing is, early in the Roman culture, it was, everyone was sort of the same. There was a very, there wasn't a lot of, the caste system that we talked about in India. There wasn't a lot of class warfare, or what do you want to say, classes, like everyone in the Roman culture. In the Roman culture, there was no wide, early in the culture, there was no wide, there wasn't, the gap between rich and poor was not that great. That's what I want to say. There's no wide gap between rich and poor. It was like, and it was primarily because this family structure that dominated. They had a commitment to service. They had a commitment to service for their country and for their family. So once they conquered the Italian peninsula here, once they conquered this Italian peninsula here, they started looking to these other things, and they started seeing the merchandising that was going on here and the trading that was going on here, and their efficiency made it, their efficiency and their family structure made it easy for them to, to conquer these territories. So that's the beginning of that. At a certain point, though, the powerful people began to want to control, oppress, as it says in Proverbs. The powerful people wanted to oppress the poor people, and the slave population. So at the beginning of the Roman Empire, at the beginning of this, when it was small, there was no wide gap between rich and poor, but that changed. And there began to be, fewer and fewer people began to own land. Fewer people began to own land. Early in there, it was the farmer. What was happening was, as Rome began to take over these territories, they would begin to import. Sounds like interesting history repeats itself. They would begin to import cheap wheat from Egypt and cheap fruit from Spain, and they would be imported into this area, and that would mean that the farmers couldn't sell their produce for as much as they used to. And so the first group of people that really was affected by the development of the Roman structure was the farmers. The farmers began to sell their land and move to the cities. Sold land, moved to the cities. Just one problem: there were no jobs in the cities. They moved to they sold their land, they moved to the cities. At a certain point, it was estimated that fewer than 2,000, now you think about, probably look at all this territory, and think about the millions of people that are probably living in that territory at that time. But really, in the land of Rome, fewer than 2,000 families owned land. And this was creating some sort of tension, obviously, a lot of tension in the, among the people. So what happened was the early government really was ruled by a king, and most of these kings came from the north part of Italy here, and they were ruling. And the king was the head of the nation, he was the father of the state, and he was the ruler of the people. And he was the chief judge and also a high priest, really. With their religious structure, this will happen later on, they really considered the emperor as a priest of some sort. When the emperors would come along later on, father, ruler, and a priest of some sort in their temples, And so this was early. They had a monarchy, really. But they began this idea of an assembly in about 500 BC, the assembly, the Senate. It's called the Senate, about 500 BC. And this was designed to have people, they were developing what's called a republican form of government, republican form. And this is not direct democracy. We live in a republic. We elect representatives. They make the laws, and we choose to live by those laws. Or if we don't like the laws that people are making, what do? We vote the suckers out. Oh, sorry. Okay, sorry. That's my political statement for the night. There you go. If you don't like what's happening in your city, in your capital, you vote them out. That's your right as a citizen, to go and cast your ballot and say, they're spending all my money, I don't like them. And you should do that. Okay, You shouldn't like scream and yell and everything like that. You should just, go very quietly and cast your ballot, and hopefully enough people, when you get some people in Washington who will actually want to do something. I'm sorry. I just saw the word, republic, form of government. So don't look at that Republican as like a political statement right there on the thing. A republic is a representative government. Okay, that's what it is. The assembly of century, they called them centuries. That meant they were supposed to be older, wise men were supposed to be serving in the Senate. Older, wise men. Sort of like, you have to be older in the United States to serve in the Senate. You're supposed to be an older, wise man. Just leave that right out there for you. Okay. So anyway, there's a Republican form of government. You vote and you select, and these senators would decide that. They also developed really what's called the 12 tables. 12 tables. This happened this is like if you want to know, we are at the beginning of the United States the beginning of the United States Constitution, I think it says that. No, I think it's the Declaration of Independence. It says, we hold that all men everywhere are created equal and hold certain inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The 12 tables were published. This was like one of the first published laws. These were written in stone, laws written in stone at the Roman Forum, so that everyone could see them, so that the people could say, this is my right. This was like really one of the first, maybe, constitutions that was printed and actually shown. So they had the Republican form of limited representative government, and they had a reverence for the rule of law, and these are the two greatest contributions that they've given us in terms of our civilization that we live in right now. So they wrote these laws that applied to all people. But there was trouble. Tyrants would come and they would do away with the law, or they wouldn't practice it, but they would expand. They would go from this small republic that was sort of based on the peninsula with its islands here, and then they would start taking over this. And they had a grand idea to conquer all of this, and the military men were interested in conquests, because the conquests would bring them, slave labor into the territory, and it would also bring territory. If you were a soldier, you could actually be what they would call a legionnaire, like you were part of a Roman legion. If you conquered a territory, and then after you retired from the service, they would give you a piece of territory. Actually, some of the best churches, some of the great churches, Galatia, I believe, and Philippi, both of those areas were Roman legionnaire kinds of cities. Like many soldiers decided to descend on those cities and set up their lives after retirement. So, that was part of the reason why they wanted to be in the army, and why the idea of conquering these territories became, it's just you get a taste of power and you want more. That's the history of human civilization. And any kind of empire that was trying, actually, in the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s, Adolf Hitler saw himself as the Third Reich, meaning that it would be that there was the Roman Empire, there was the Holy Roman Empire, which was in the Middle Ages, and then Adolf Hitler saw himself as the new Caesar of the next Roman Empire, the Third Roman Empire, and that was in his mind, in his twisted mind, which was, and we see that he acted pretty much like an ancient kind of, warrior man in destroying people and killing people and enslaving people, any kind of opposition. So, several wars were fought to conquer these. Carthage here, this was a African society, North African society. They controlled this little strait right here. You see that? And like it goes out to the ocean. This was an important kind of thoroughfare. And there was a large war there. That was a major war that was won. You maybe have seen stories of Hannibal. Hannibal marched with elephants over here and won a decisive victory just outside Rome, but it cost him so much men and resources that it left Carthage. Actually, the Romans let him attack from behind, and they just marched across the strait or sailed across the strait and burned Carthage. Actually, what Carthage is now, it doesn't exist anymore. This little territory, this is important because this would become a pattern of what Rome would do to cities that would give them too much trouble. After they defeated them and they expended lots of energies and dead soldiers, once they finally captured the city, they tore it all down. They tore it all down, they burned it down, and they salted the earth. They salted the earth so nothing would grow there ever again. So when we get into next week's class, we talk about 70 A.D. when Jerusalem, which is right here, when Jerusalem and the war between Israel and Rome got out of hand. When Rome finally captured Jerusalem, they wiped it out also. Only another war that summoned the leader back to Rome kept them from just really flattening the whole territory of Jerusalem. We still have some architecture that's left behind from that area. Okay? You all right? You with me? Okay. Well, the interesting kind of thing is that, because of the conquests and everything like that, and the kind of parades that they would have after all the conquests, the military men became very interested. They weren't interested. The military generals became very interested in controlling all of government. So this is a pattern, and this is, so what would happen is like around 200 BC is when military leaders began to be the champions of the poor, because a lot of poor people served, they didn't have any other jobs, so they became excellent soldiers. And then when they got power, they began to promise things, and promise to be their leaders. So there was a series of these kind of men that did a champion of the poor. Two of them, their names were Gracchus. The first one was Tiberius Gracchus, and then his son was Gaius Gracchus. These two men, they had a policy. And you'll find that it's the same. It was bread and circus. Bread and circus. We're going to make people happy. It's like Coca-Cola and American Idol. It's like Dr. Pepper and Survivor. I'm serious. This is like, this is it. Okay, so we have bread and circus. So we have the Roman, this is the inside of the Colosseum. This is the inside of the Colosseum. What you're looking at is what it looks like now, but beneath this is where all of the animals were kept, and there was like a wooden floor on this covered with sand, and you would have your fights to the death, your gladiator. I mean, how many have seen that movie? Okay, that movie is really sourced in truth. They would bring in slaves, they would have fights to the death, they would put people in there to fight animals to the death, and it was all based on entertainment. Cheap bread and circuses. This was the way the military commanders would keep the people happy. Cheap bread and circuses. And, they became very, these things sat probably about 60 to 70,000 people. They'd put 60 to 70,000 people in, they'd have a bloody war on the thing there, and the people would just scream their lungs out. Sort of like a football game on Sunday. That's the great is Diana of the Ephesians, or whatever they would say. Kill, 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 sack him, destroy. Those kind of things. I don't really say anything. Really, yes. I did yell. I was very happy yesterday because my team won easily, but I still lost my voice from screaming at the TV. So anyway, but we're not talking about next week's game at all. I'm not saying a word. I'm silent about next week's game. Okay. So anyway, so that was the first, these two, bread and circuses. But, civil wars kept coming, like these men would die and then another tyrant would rise up. They would die and another tyrant would rise up, and that's what would happen during the course of the history. But around 60 BC, it's important, this is an important mark in this. Around 60 BC, a man named Julius Caesar, and you probably read Julius Caesar in high school. You probably read the Shakespearean tragedy, Julius Caesar in high school. But Julius Caesar was a member of the first triumvirate, which was these three guys decided to get together: a philosopher, like sort of an educator, a senator, and a general who was Caesar. Caesar, of course, would be the most powerful, but they would govern. They would govern, and he became the benevolent dictator, but he had help and counsel with the Senate. So from 60 BC, he came, and he, till 45 BC, he sort of solidified the government. He solidified the government of Rome. He had the respect of the army. He didn't have the respect of everyone, as we'll see in a second. He didn't have this respect of everyone, but he had the respect of the army and the common people. The common people, they heard him gladly. Sort of like Jesus. When Jesus came, the common people heard him gladly. Of course, Jesus had bread, too. When he fed the 5,000, they wanted to make him a king. That was part of it. So there's bread and circuses. There's another circus. You can look at that. That's the chariot races. That's where they had the chariot races there. That's kind of, if you get in a little closer, maybe. That's kind of interesting. Looks like a NASCAR track, doesn't it? It's not a full. Well, no, it's not. But that's where you watch Ben-Hur and you see the chariot races. That's the kind of thing. That's one of the grand circuses. I think that's in Nero's day. Nero and Caligula were the two most. Ben-Hur. Yeah, you ever watch the movie Ben-Hur? They have the chariot race. That's the kind of circus they had the chariot race in. So, kind of interesting. So, but Julius, the common people, Julius Caesar had those common people there, but, excuse me. This is a look at, this is a sculpture from the Vatican, and this is what your Roman army would look like. Those are some of the weaponry and the horses, the way they rode. You could see how well equipped they are. And so they were the heroes of the people, sort of like your football stars today. They're wearing their helmets and their things and their shoulder pads and everything there. And, they were the heroes of the people, so they carved these things for them. So the army became, very popular throughout the Roman era. This is the assassination of Julius Caesar. He's there with, there's Brutus with the knife there. That's the famous line from Et tu, Brute, in Shakespeare. And he's getting stabbed. He's got his hand on his head. He's going to cut his throat there. So that was done by a group of senators, if you can believe that. A group of senators decided to kill Julius Caesar because they didn't like the fact that the army was ruling everything at this time. Octavian came after him. Octavian, and then he called himself Augustus, and that's important because this is the person that will bring us to Jesus Christ. Augustus Caesar, Octavian Augustus Caesar, he would be the emperor from 31 BC to 14 AD. So he would bring in this era of 50 years of, governmental stability to the Roman Empire. Now the Roman Empire is still flexing its muscle. It's still not settled. This is the beginning of what they call, this is a Latin term, Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. And this would last until 180 AD. So from about 31 BC, when Octavian assumed the emperorship and solidified the Roman era, solidified the Roman Empire under him as the leader, this would be almost 200 years of like peace. Now, during this time, Jesus Christ will be born, and the church will be born. And it's important. Why is this important for us? Because this period of stability will make it possible for the rise and the spread of Christianity. Now remember, okay, now let's talk about this. The gods that are, let's think about some of the gods that are part of the Roman culture. Okay, the gods, okay, Zeus and Jupiter. Zeus or Jupiter, these are like these Greek gods. A flawed person, thunder, lightning power, but a real mean streak. Fathered Hercules with a mortal woman. Okay, so like you see here. Okay, all right. Now I want you to see, like you go back to the idea of what was happening in Noah's day. In Noah, before the flood, it said that the sons of God, angels, saw that the women of the earth were fair, so they were possessing men in some capacity to have relations with women. So now you get like okay, where does the idea of Zeus having a relationship with a mortal come from? And then Hercules is born. Where does that come from? It comes from back in that, all of these cultures have their roots in the boat. Noah and his family. So a lot of these little things that linger in these, these little ideas, you can piece them back to the Bible and say, where did the idea of Zeus, Jupiter having a relationship with a mortal woman come in, enter the picture? Well, it was probably, it got contorted through the centuries after the flood, but before the flood, this was happening. Supernatural beings were inhabiting men in a certain way, and they were having relations with women, and there were men of renown, powerful, demon-possessed kind of people were being born and like controlling. That's why the floodwaters had to stay on the earth for so many days, because those guys were doggy paddling. They were supernatural doggy paddling until they drowned. That's my guess about it in the time of Noah. But that's what Zeus. The other god was Neptune, the god of the sea. They're really they're polytheistic. They're many gods, power, all these things. Apollos, the god of war. And then, he's the god of poetry. God of, who is the god of? Mars is the god of war. Sorry, Mars is the god of war. Venus or Aphrodite, and that's the goddess of love, and those things. Artemis. So these gods, these are the kind of gods, these are the kind of people power, and to this element they added the emperor. The emperor was seen as a god. This didn't really happen during Augustus. He saw himself as a priest to the gods, but his successors like Nero and Caligula and I think it's Domitian, they demanded absolute worship, and because the Christians would not worship men nor bow down to them, that stimulated some of the wild persecutions that went on during the course of the early church. I think there's 10 persecutions that carry us up to 313, and we'll begin looking at that next week. But to 313 AD, after Christ, there will be 10 serious persecutions that will happen. Excuse me. So what did the Romans contribute after this expansion and the circuses, all these things, Julius Caesar, all these things. After Octavian became, and he had the triumph, and he began ruling, they began a massive stimulus package. Public works package. Really, they started putting everybody to work on roads and water projects. Okay? Roads and water projects. Okay? This is important for us to understand because, lead people. Okay, so we'll go to this. We see there's Julius is dead. Okay, let's go back. Those are for the next part. Okay, there's the Roman. So there's your Colosseum. That's the outside of the Colosseum. Looks sort of like like our football stadiums of today, like the big monstrosity they built in Dallas, $1 billion, amazing, 500-foot TV screen, even more than that, right? Something like that, huge TV screen. Okay, there's the circus. This is aqueduct. This is an aqueduct. Okay, this would carry water from the mountains down into the cities. Okay, or collect rain, and it would run along the trenches that are in there. This is still there. This is still in Segovia, Italy. This is how Rome built things. Okay? You'd think maybe, every time I run through a pothole, I think, why didn't the Romans build my road? Because look at this road. Look at that. That don't have any potholes. That doesn't have any potholes. Maybe that's a big long one down the middle. But look at that. That road's been there since the time of Christ. This road is in, this road is also, I think this road is in southern France. This road is still there, and I don't know if it's used by cars or anything like that, but it's certainly, look, it's straight. I mean, and it's flat. It's like amazing. You think we could do this in Baltimore City? Vote for me, I'll make it happen. No, I'm sorry. I'm not running for office, no. I used to threaten to do that at my old job. I said, I'm leaving the newspapers and I'm going to run for mayor. And they said, I'll vote for you. Yeah, sure. Okay. Anyway, but that's, this was the public works projects. This would be like, this is what people who didn't have money or jobs to do. They were given these things to do. They would lay these roads, and the Roman commitment to this kind of order made it. This road is very important because this made it possible for Paul to travel by foot or by chariot or whatever he would ride on in these areas. And these roads were also pretty safe because the Roman legions would be marching up and down them all the time. You talk about state troopers. You had Roman legions constantly on these roads to battle bandits and to make sure that the flow of the mail system went. That's another thing that would happen there. There would be a system of couriers that would, as this goes back to the time of Esther. If you read in Esther, you notice, remember Haman sent out the couriers to all parts of the Persian Empire? Well, that was one great thing that Rome did. If you had a good idea, they kept it, and they claimed it as their own. We're the bosses, but we're going to let you keep some of your ideas. And so this public works projects, progressed, and they would do this in the early empire. And this, so the empire became very closely connected. The soldiers could get to trouble spots very quickly on these roads, and then the water. So roads and water, these water projects made the cities very popular. People came to the cities to live there, and that would also lead to some of the downfall of the culture, because people who work the earth are hardworking people. Farmers are hardworking people, and that would lead to some trouble in what would happen with Rome. So about this time, this is the, so we have the two. Let's get our thing here. This is the foundation. Let's draw something like this. We have the foundation here. We have the foundation. We have the Greek culture and education. Has permeated the world there, and then you have this Roman efficiency, administration, military. Roman administration, the military, making these roads. And we also have this other thing that's happening. We have Jewish, that we'll look at in the last part of our class here, Jewish disorganization. okay, which really is the confusion that came from their sin, okay? So we have, if you go back to the first part of Numbers, or in Numbers, you will see that there is like 660,000 men. 660,000 men, and you can extrapolate that out, that the men probably were the leaders of at least an average family of 5 or 6. So if you multiply that, you have about 3 million people of Israel. Okay, 3 million of people of Israel who went out of Egypt, marched to the Promised Land, and entered, the majority of them entered the Promised Land at some point in that, okay? So that's the height of Israel during the days of Solomon. Maybe they reached a total of 5 million during the height of Solomon and David. That's where they were. But then their sin led them into captivity. And then in the book of Ezra, we count up only 42,600 total would return to Jerusalem. Okay? 42,600 would return to Jerusalem. So these three things: the Greek culture and education, the language is there, the peace is there, the military, the semblance of peace is there. There's order. Let's just call it order, not peace. Enforced order is in the world, in that area of the world. And then you have this group of people who are really supposed to be God's voice. Okay? The oracles of God was committed to this group of people. They are supposed to be God's voice to the world. To the world. When Solomon built his temple, and at that height, they were God's voice in the world. People were coming from all over the world to hear the wisdom of Solomon. But now, sin and captivity had reduced them to this number, 42,000. This is 660,000 men. Here, only 42,000 people returned to Jerusalem in the time of Ezra to rebuild the city. Okay? The Emperor Cyrus, the Emperor Darius, all of these men gave them in the Persian Empire, gave Israel, the people of Israel, the right to return. Go back to your city. So, this territory of Jerusalem is the center of trouble again. Okay? It's it always has been really the center of trouble. But it's the center of trouble because there is disorganization here, and there are groups of people who are fighting over this piece of territory because of its proximity to the area next to the Mediterranean Sea. Tyre, Sidon, these port cities were very valuable in these days. And, because of the amount of money that was going, it's always the love of money is the root of all evil. Because of the amount of money that was being made in the commerce and the trade that was going on, because it was just, this little place, Israel. We'll go back to the beginning. Israel was becoming the center of all things again. So there we have it, right there, this little piece of territory, right there along the Mediterranean Sea. Rome now controls all of this area, all the way, most of this area around in here and up into Britain. But this area right here is going to be, is going to become the center of all history, and it always has been the center of all history. Sodom and Gomorrah was there. All of these things is the center of all history. So these three elements, make the way for the Messiah. They make the way for the Messiah to arrive and visit his people. Okay, let's stop there right now. We'll take 10 minutes, come back at 1:15, and we'll talk about Jesus Christ. I know you've been waiting for it the whole class. When are we going to talk about Jesus in the church history? We're going to start talking about the arrival of Jesus Christ into the world situation. Okay.